Queer people have always existed, from the Stone Age and before through to the 21st century. Queer history doesn't start and end at LGBTQ History Month. At AKT, we work year-round with young LGBTQ people experiencing or at risk of homelessness or living in hostile environments. In 2023, our work is more vital than ever. That's why we exist. Different cultures and languages have talked about and treated queer people differently throughout history, but we've always been there. Here at AKT, we've created a timeline of landmark LGBTQ historical and political events that have shaped our community and our society. Some have taken us forwards and some, sadly, backwards. But to give you the full picture, we should probably start as early as we can. Sometime between 2900 and 2500 BC, a person is buried. Clothing was gendered at the time, but the clothing in which the person buried didn't correspond to the sex that she may have been assigned at birth. Archaeologists have speculated that the burial corresponds to the burial of a person who we would now refer to as transgender. Fast forward a century or so to ancient Egypt, around the time of the pyramids being built. Royal servants Khnumhotep and Niankhunum are believed to be the first same-sex couple recorded history. Like we said, queer people have always been here. But legislation in the UK began to curtail our rights in 1533, when Henry VIII passes the Buggery Act, making all male-male sexual activity punishable by death. Lots happens over the next few hundred years, but in 1861, Parliament declares that homosexual acts in Britain are no longer punishable by the death penalty. Isn't that nice? However, they do remain illegal and punishable by imprisonment. It stays that way for a long time. In the 20th century, we see signs that things might be getting better. Magnus Hirschfeld opens the pioneering Institute of Sexual Research in Berlin, providing a world-first centre for research into gay and transgender life. People from across Europe come to research and learn more about their gender or sexuality. Many stay and gain jobs at the Institute, including Dora Richter, who, in 1931, becomes the first known person to undergo surgery to affirm her gender. A huge step forward, but sadly, her case was a rare one. 2 decades later in Britain, the Wolfenden Report is published in 1957. It advises the UK government to legalise homosexuality. However, it's not until 10 years later, in 1967, that homosexuality is legalised, as long as the acts occur in private. The second half of the 20th century sees the onset of a global gay rights movement. On the 1st of July 1972, the Gay Liberation Front marched from Trafalgar Square to Hyde Park in London, marking the start of the UK's first Gay Pride March. However, 9 years later, in 1981, the first case of what is later known as AIDS is documented in the UK, as a 49-year-old man is admitted to hospital and sadly dies 10 days later. In 1985, in response to the government's inaction on queer rights and the vilification of minors, Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners is founded, a campaign of LGBTQ support for striking workers in the miners' strike of 1984 and 1985. Fast forward 2 years to 1987, and government hostility has continued. Margaret Thatcher issues a statement at a Conservative Party conference. She claims that children who need to be taught to respect the traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. Her statement ushers in new legislation. Section 28 of the Local Government Act states that schools and local authorities can't intentionally promote homosexuality or promote the teaching in any school of the acceptability of homosexuality. The same year, AKT is founded in Manchester. Ally Kath Hall and 6 volunteers set up our charity as the Albert Kennedy Trust. 1 year later, in 1989, the Tavistock Clinic establishes the Gender Identity Development Service, or GIDS, the first and only service of its kind in England. 7 years after our founding, in 1988, AKT wins the 1996 Stonewall Equality Award. Lots happens in the intervening years, but cut to the 21st century and, in 2001, the age of consent is lowered for gay and bi people to 16, bringing laws in line with those applied to their straight peers. 2 years later, in 2003, 15 years after its inception, Section 28 is repealed in the UK. It lifts the ban on local authorities from teaching children and young people about the acceptability of homosexuality, a step forward for LGBTQ+ rights in the field of education. 10 years later, there are celebrations up and down the country as same-sex marriage is legalised in England and Wales. The first marriages take place on the 29th of March 2014. However, just 2 years later, AKT publishes research that indicates that a staggering 24% of young people who are at risk of homelessness identify as LGBTQ+. 5 years later, in March 2020, the UK goes into lockdown. Across the first lockdown, footfall to our services increased by 71%. The next year, the UK holds its 2021 census, which includes questions on sexuality and gender identity for the first time. In April of 2021, the next month, AKT released our LGBTQ+ youth homelessness report. Our report examines the relationship between homelessness and race, disability, faith, sexuality, and gender. In researching the report, we found that just 13% of young people who'd experienced homelessness felt that they had been supported by parents or step-parents whilst they were homeless. For trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people, this drops to just 8%. The following year, in April 2022, many LGBTQ+ organisations, including AKT, withdraw support from the government's Safe to Be Me conference because of the government's U-turn on banning conversion therapy. In May 2022, AKT released our Inclusive Housing Report, which reveals that 19% of housing associations and local authorities do not reference LGBTQ+ homelessness or LGBTQ+ youth homelessness in any of their policies. A lack of awareness by local authorities of LGBTQ+ issues leads to worse housing outcomes for LGBTQ+ people. For example, our research with Generation Rent the same year shows that 40% of LGBTQ+ people live in unsuitable housing. That's 10% more than their non-LGBTQ+ counterparts. In October of 2022, Home Office hate crime statistics show a reported 41% increase in hate crimes against LGBT people and a shocking 56% against trans people. The same month, in October 2022, AKT released our Impact Report, which shows that our digital services team grew by 200% to cover growing national demand for our services. In December 2022, the Scottish Parliament passes its Gender Recognition Reform Bill, which improves the system by which trans people can apply for legal recognition through a gender recognition certificate. However, the following month, in January of this year, the UK government in Westminster announced its intention to block the Scottish government from enacting this bill. Which brings us to now. The issues that affect LGBTQ+ people do not start and end at LGBTQ+ History Month. A cost of living crisis, increased levels of hate on the streets and in the press, mean that LGBTQ+ people, and particularly LGBTQ+ young people, are particularly vulnerable. Every young person should have the freedom to live freely in an environment that is safe and supportive. That's why we exist.